Or any conversations with your father?
Oh, yeah. Lots of, I remember lots of conversations. I mean, he and I spent a lot of time together.
3 minutes ago, Elvis Presley's daughter said something she was never supposed to say. Guess what it is? It's a confession about his final moments that has been buried for decades. What she revealed doesn't honor the legend, it exposes him. And if this is true, then Elvis didn't leave this world as fans imagine. He left carrying something far darker. Stay tuned as we unravel the untold truth about Elvis Presley told by his own daughter, the woman who knew him first. Before the world fell in love with Elvis Presley, before the screaming fans and sold-out shows and global fame that turned him into a legend, there was one person who knew him as just a man, and that person was Priscilla Presley. She was not a fan looking up at a stage or a journalist trying to capture his magic or a historian piecing together his story decades later, but rather the woman who lived with him behind closed doors, who saw the fear in his eyes when the cameras turned off, who witnessed the contradictions between the confident performer and the deeply insecure human being, and who understood his emotional dependence and isolation in ways no one else could. Priscilla met Elvis when she was just 14 years old, long before she understood what it would mean to be attached to a man the world refused to let be ordinary. She watched him transform from a rising star into a cultural phenomenon. And as that transformation accelerated, she became something more than a partner or a wife. She became the first gatekeeper of his private life. Not by choice, but by necessity. Because the Elvis the world wanted to see was not the Elvis who existed in reality, and someone had to manage that gap. She helped shape and protect the image of Elvis Presley after fame exploded in ways that made him larger than life, deciding what was allowed to be seen and what had to be hidden, because the myth required careful construction. The public saw the charm, the generosity, the charisma, the man who could light up a room with a smile, but they did not see the late-night paranoia, the self-doubt, the prescription pill bottles, or the loneliness that consumed him even when surrounded by people. Priscilla understood that silence was not just a preference, but a survival strategy, because the truth would have shattered the illusion that millions of people had invested in. When their daughter, Lisa Marie, was born on February 1, 1968, Priscilla became something else entirely, a bridge between Elvis and the child who would grow up in a household where truth was carefully managed. Lisa Marie entered a world where her father was worshipped by strangers, but remained a mystery even to those who lived with him. And from her earliest memories, she was raised around a man the world saw as invincible, but who she knew as something very different. Lisa Marie viewed her father through the lens of a child trying to understand why someone so powerful could feel so unreachable, why someone so loving could be so distant, and why someone so present in the world's imagination could be so absent in her daily reality. She adored him, but she also felt the weight of his absence, even when he was in the same room, because his mind was always somewhere else, trapped between the person he wanted to be and the person the world demanded he remain. Much of what Lisa knew about her father came filtered through her mother, who chose what to explain and what to protect her from. And there were things that were never put into words because Priscilla believed some truths were too heavy for a child to carry. She told Lisa Marie stories about Elvis that painted him as complex but never dangerous, troubled but never broken, and she shielded her daughter from the darker realities that might have poisoned the love Lisa felt for him. For decades after Elvis left the world, Priscilla kept the story contained, managing his estate and his legacy with the same discipline she had used to manage his image while he was alive. She allowed some cracks to show, admitting to struggles and imperfections, but she never fully opened the door to the secrets she had been protecting since the day she first walked into Graceland as a teenager. Lisa Marie, for her part, kept her own version of the story locked away, honoring the silence her mother had modeled, respecting the boundaries that had been set long before she was old enough to question them. But something has changed. And Lisa Marie is now speaking about things her mother never publicly said, about moments the world was never meant to know, and about final words that were never supposed to leave the room where they were spoken. What is about to be revealed does not attack Elvis's legacy or attempt to destroy the memory of a man who brought joy to millions, but rather, it exposes the truth Priscilla spent a lifetime protecting, and the truth Lisa Marie has finally decided the world must hear, no matter how painful or disruptive it may be. The man behind the king. The world learned to see Elvis as confident, a man who walked into any room and owned it without effort, who commanded stages with a presence that made everyone else fade into the background. He was always in control, never rattled, never uncertain, and certainly never afraid, because fear was not part of the image that had been sold to the public. This was the Elvis that appeared on television, that smiled from magazine covers, that signed autographs and kissed babies, and made people believe that greatness came naturally to him. But the private version of Elvis was something entirely different, and the people who lived with him knew it. He was a man surrounded by people at all times, but emotionally alone in ways that were almost unbearable, loved by millions across the world, but understood by very few, if any at all. He was dependent on routine because spontaneity terrified him, dependent on reassurance because self-doubt haunted him constantly, and dependent on control because the loss of it felt like the loss of everything. Fame did not just elevate Elvis. It slowly erased his humanity, stripping away the permission to be anything other than perfect. There was no room for him to fail, no space for him to be weak, and no permission to age or struggle or change in ways that normal people are allowed to. The world wanted him frozen in time, forever young and powerful and untouchable. And the weight of that expectation became a prison he could never escape. The protection and image management that surrounded Elvis became part of the machinery that kept him functioning, and the public was only allowed to know what could be safely shared without damaging the illusion. Stories were intentionally softened or omitted, struggles were reframed as quirks, and silence became part of survival, because admitting the truth would have collapsed the entire myth that so many people had invested in emotionally and financially. This affected his relationship with his daughter in ways that shaped her entire understanding of who her father was, because Lisa Marie grew up knowing two completely different versions of him. There was the man at home, the one who could be affectionate but distant, present but unreachable. And then there was the man on stage, the one the world screamed for and worshipped, and she struggled to reconcile the legend with the parent. The confusion between those two identities left her questioning which version was real, or if either one truly was. The emotional contradiction was staggering, because here was a father who could fill stadiums with tens of thousands of people, who could make entire audiences weep or erupt in joy with a single note, but who could feel impossibly far away in private moments when it was just the two of them. Lisa Marie wanted her father's attention, but she was competing with an image that demanded everything from him, leaving little room for the quiet, ordinary love that children need. Even at the end, the myth demanded a performance from Elvis, because strength was expected and vulnerability was unacceptable in a man who had built his entire identity on appearing invincible. Weakness had no audience, and admitting that he was struggling would have felt like betraying everyone who believed in the image he had worked so hard to maintain. So he kept going, pushing through exhaustion and pain and fear, pretending that everything was fine even when it clearly was not. But if the world never saw Elvis struggle, if the public was only shown the polished and controlled version of his life, then what else was hidden behind the gates of Graceland and the carefully managed press releases? What truth was too dangerous to speak while he was alive, and what could only be revealed years later when the people who protected him were finally ready to let the real story be told? The daughter caught between worship and truth. Lisa Marie Presley was not born into normalcy. She was born into mythology, and from her very first breath, she existed in a space where her father belonged more to the world than he did to her. As a child, She did not understand fame or legacy or the machinery that turned a man into an icon, but she did understand that the person everyone else screamed for was the same person who sometimes felt like a stranger in her own home. There was love, deep and genuine love, but it was always tangled with distance, with absences that could not be explained, with moments where he was physically present but emotionally somewhere else entirely. Growing up inside a legend meant living with constant confusion between who Elvis was to her and who he was to everyone else. Because the man the world worshipped as invincible was the same man who seemed fragile and unreachable behind closed doors. She would watch him on television, surrounded by adoring fans, commanding attention with effortless charisma, and then she would see him at home, exhausted and withdrawn, needing reassurance and struggling with demons that no one outside the walls of Graceland was allowed to know about. The disconnect was impossible to reconcile, especially for a child who just wanted her father to be fully hers, even if only for a moment. There were beautiful moments where Elvis felt present, where he would play with her and make her laugh and give her his undivided attention in ways that made her feel like the most important person in the world. Those moments were magic, and they were real, and they were what she held on to when everything else felt uncertain. But there were also long stretches where he felt unreachable, locked behind a wall of exhaustion or medication, or the crushing weight of expectations that never allowed him to rest. And during those times, Lisa Marie learned what it meant to love someone who could not always love you back in the way you needed. The emotional cost of never fully knowing her father was something she would carry for the rest of her life, because there were questions she wanted to ask but never could, truths she sensed but was too young to articulate, and a longing for connection that was always just slightly out of reach. She knew her father loved her, but she also knew that love was competing with forces much larger than either of them. Forces that demanded his energy and his time and his very identity in ways that left little room for quiet, ordinary fatherhood. Silence became normal in the family, not because people were being intentionally dishonest, but because there were things that simply could not be spoken aloud without risking everything. Lisa learned early that some truths were not for the world, that there were things she saw and heard that had to stay within the walls of Graceland, and that protecting her father's image was not just a choice but a responsibility. She understood, even as a child, that the myth of Elvis Presley was fragile, and that the wrong words spoken to the wrong person could shatter it completely. This created a strange duality in her life, where she had to hold two versions of reality in her mind at the same time: the public story that everyone believed and the private truth that she lived with. She could not reconcile them, and she was not supposed to try, because doing so would have meant choosing between loyalty to her father and honesty about what she experienced. So she learned to compartmentalize, to accept that there were things about Elvis that would never make sense, and to live with the uncomfortable awareness that the man the world celebrated was not the complete picture of who he actually was. What Elvis actually told his daughter. The moment Elvis spoke to his daughter was confession, raw and unfiltered. The kind of admission that comes when someone has run out of energy to maintain the walls they have built around themselves and simply needs to tell the truth before it is too late. He told her about his fears, and they were not the kind of fears that could be easily dismissed or solved with money or fame or success. He was afraid that he was losing control of his own life, that the decisions being made about him and for him were no longer his to make, and that he had become a passenger in a machine that would not stop moving even if he wanted it to. He feared that fame had hollowed him out, taking everything that made him real and replacing it with a performance that everyone loved, but that left him feeling empty and disconnected from himself. He was afraid that people loved the idea of him rather than him, that the man they screamed for and worshipped did not actually exist and never had, and that if they ever saw who he really was, they would be disappointed or disgusted or simply uninterested. He feared that he would be remembered wrongly, that history would preserve the image and ignore the person, and that everything he had tried to express through his music and his presence would be reduced to spectacle and nostalgia. Most of all, he was afraid that he was running out of time to fix anything, that the mistakes he had made were permanent, and the damage he had caused was irreversible. He admitted he felt trapped by the system around him, that the people who claimed to protect him were actually controlling him, and that he did not know how to break free without losing everything. He acknowledged that he often felt powerless despite his status as one of the most famous men in the world, because fame without agency is just another kind of prison. He confessed that he did not know how to stop the decline, that he could see himself falling apart but lacked the strength or the knowledge or the support to change course. He revealed how lonely he felt, even when surrounded by people, because none of those people really knew him, and none of them could fill the emptiness that had settled deep inside him. The regret about fatherhood was the emotional core of everything he said, and it was the part that hurt Lisa Marie the most because it confirmed what she had always suspected but hoped was not true. Elvis admitted he was not the father she deserved, that he had failed her in fundamental ways that could not be undone or apologized away. He acknowledged the missed time he could never get back, the birthdays and school events and ordinary moments that he had chosen to sacrifice for the stage and the spotlight. He expressed guilt for choosing performance over presence, for prioritizing the love of strangers over the needs of his own child, and for allowing his career to consume the time and energy that should have belonged to his family. He recognized that his daughter knew him more as a myth than a parent, that she had grown up watching him from a distance and trying to reconcile the man the world worshipped with the absent figure who appeared occasionally in her life. He admitted he did not know how to be normal with her, that the machinery of fame had stripped away his ability to simply sit and be present without distraction or performance, and that even when he wanted to connect with her, he did not know how to bridge the gap that fame had created between them. He told her he wished he had protected her from the weight of his fame, that he should have shielded her from the chaos and pressure and dysfunction that came with being Elvis Presley's daughter. He acknowledged that she had grown up carrying confusion and distance, never quite sure where she stood in his life, or whether his love was real or just another part of the performance. He regretted letting others come between them emotionally, allowing managers and handlers and even well-meaning family members to create barriers that prevented him from being the father he wanted to be. His unresolved feelings about Priscilla, Lisa Marie's mother, surfaced as well, because those feelings were tangled up in everything else he was trying to express. He felt regret over how their relationship ended, not because he thought they should have stayed together, but because he knew the separation had shaped Lisa Marie's childhood in painful ways. He was aware that their divorce had fractured the family and left their daughter caught between two worlds, never fully at home in either one. He acknowledged mistakes he never corrected, moments where his pride or his need for control had prevented him from doing what was right, and he admitted that those choices had cost him his family in ways he only fully understood after it was too late. This moment shattered her understanding of her father completely, because she saw the man behind the legend in ways she never had before, and realized that he knew his failures and carried them with a weight that made the loss harder rather than easier. It would have been easier to believe he left the world unaware of the damage he had caused. But knowing that he understood and regretted it made his passing feel like a tragedy that could have been prevented if only things had been different. Why she spoke and what the world must face now. Lisa Marie Presley stayed silent for so long not because she had nothing to say, but because she had too much to say and no safe way to say it. For decades, she carried her father's final words like a burden she was not sure the world was ready to receive, and she understood that speaking them would change everything about how people remembered him. It was not just about protecting his legacy, though that was part of it, but also about protecting herself from the judgment and backlash that would inevitably come from shattering an illusion that millions of people still clung to desperately. Fear played a role as well, because speaking the truth about someone as beloved as Elvis Presley meant risking her own place in the story and inviting scrutiny into her motives and her character. She knew people would accuse her of seeking attention or trying to profit from pain or betraying her father's memory, even though none of those things were true. The easier path was always silence, allowing the myth to continue unchallenged while she carried the weight of what she knew in private, and for a long time, that felt like the only option. Loyalty also kept her quiet, because she loved her father deeply despite everything, and she did not want to be the person who destroyed the image he had worked so hard to build and maintain throughout his life. She remembered the man who held her and made her laugh and told her he loved her, and she did not want those memories overshadowed by the darker truths that existed alongside them. But loyalty to a memory can only hold back the truth for so long, especially when that truth carries a lesson the world desperately needs to hear. Something changed within Lisa Marie over time, a shift that came from emotional readiness and the realization that silence was no longer serving anyone, least of all her father. She reached a point where she wanted her father remembered honestly rather than perfectly, where she understood that protecting the myth was actually disrespecting the man, because it erased the struggles and the humanity that made him real. Perfection is not a tribute, it is a prison. And keeping Elvis locked in that prison even after his passing felt like a betrayal of everything he tried to tell her in those final moments. The difference between legacy and truth became clear to her in ways it had not been before. Because legacy is what we build to make ourselves feel better about loss, while truth is what actually happened, messy and complicated and sometimes painful. Elvis's legacy was constructed to inspire and entertain, to give people hope and joy and a sense of connection to something larger than themselves. But his truth was about isolation and pressure and the cost of fame that no one wanted to acknowledge because it disrupted the fantasy. The final words he spoke to his daughter reframe his entire life when understood in their full context, because they were not the words of a king addressing his subjects or a performer delivering his final act, but rather the words of a man who had spent his entire adult life trapped in a role he could not escape, warning his daughter about the dangers of fame, the loneliness of isolation, and the deadly consequences of silence. He wanted her to understand what he had learned too late, that the love of millions cannot replace real connection, that image is not identity, and that protecting a myth can destroy the person behind it. What the world must face now is the uncomfortable reality that Elvis Presley was not invincible, that the system that elevated him also consumed him, and that the silence surrounding his struggles was not kindness but complicity. His story is not just about one man's tragic end, but about what happens when we worship people instead of understanding them, when we demand perfection instead of offering compassion, and when we value the performance more than the person. Remembrance and understanding are not the same thing, and for nearly 50 years, the world has remembered Elvis without truly understanding him. We have celebrated the moments of greatness while ignoring the warning signs, honored the legacy while dismissing the pain, and turned his life into a cautionary tale that we refuse to actually learn from. Lisa Marie, speaking now, is not an attack on her father's memory, but an act of love, an attempt to finally let him be seen as he actually was, flawed and frightened and human. Elvis will always be remembered as the king, the man who changed music and culture and left an imprint on the world that will never fade. But now, finally, he can also be remembered as a man, someone who struggled and suffered and tried to warn the people he loved about the cost of everything he achieved. If she could turn back the hands of time. Lisa Marie Presley has spent most of her life wishing she could turn back the hands of time to when everything was fine, to those brief and precious moments when her father was simply her father and not the world's property, when Graceland felt like a home instead of a museum in the making, and when the future still held possibilities that had not yet been destroyed by fame and pressure, and the weight of impossible expectations. She remembers mornings when she would wake up and find her father sitting at the piano, playing softly to himself before the day began, and the demands started pouring in. And in those quiet moments, he was relaxed in ways he never was once the phone started ringing, or the entourage arrived, or the obligations pulled him away from the things that actually mattered. Those were the moments she wishes she could return to, when time moved slowly and there was no urgency, no crisis, no sense that everything was spiraling toward an ending that no one could prevent. If she could go back, she would go back to the times when her father laughed easily, when his smile was genuine, and not the rehearsed expression he wore for cameras and crowds, and when he had enough energy to be present, instead of just going through the motions of fatherhood, while his mind was somewhere else entirely. She would return to the afternoons when they would sit together without words, when his presence was enough, and she did not yet understand that his silence was a warning sign of struggles she was too young to comprehend. She wishes she could return to the version of her father who believed he still had control over his own life, before the pills became necessary to sleep, and necessary to wake, and necessary to perform, before the isolation became so complete that even surrounded by people he felt utterly alone, and before the fear took hold so deeply that he could no longer imagine a way out. She would go back to when he still had hope, when he still believed that things could get better, when he had not yet resigned himself to the slow collapse that everyone around him could see coming, but no one knew how to stop. If Lisa Marie could turn back time, she would use the knowledge she has now to ask the questions she did not know to ask then, to push past the protective walls that kept her from seeing the full truth, and to demand that the people who claimed to love her father actually help him instead of enabling the very behaviors that were destroying him. She would be louder, more insistent, less willing to accept the explanations that minimized his struggles or blamed his problems on stress or exhaustion when it was so much deeper and more dangerous than that. She would go back and refuse to let silence be the default response to pain, refuse to accept that some things were too private to discuss even when discussing them might have saved his life, and refused to participate in the performance that required everyone to pretend that Elvis was fine when he clearly was not. She would demand that he get real help from people who cared more about his well-being than about protecting his image or maintaining their access to his fame and fortune. But time does not move backward, and Lisa Marie has had to live with the reality that those moments when everything was fine are gone forever, replaced by memories that are beautiful but also painful because they remind her of what was lost. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.